I'm Alexandria Skinner, and I'm talking about the mob for my Station of the Cross. And my video is 15 minutes long, sorry, but I hope it's worth it for you. So, the mob, the crowd. Being a lawyer, I've always focused on the the trial of Jesus and the Sanhedrin and the judicial process and the evidence and the interaction between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. So it was a new thing for me to look at the crowd. And I'm going to read from John 19, verses 6, with excerpts basically 6 through 17, with a lot of stuff cut out because I'm only focusing on the crowd. And there's also a couple verses, Luke 23:20 and Matthew 27:24. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, Pontius Pilate, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Luke 23:20 says, "But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that Jesus be crucified." So Pilate goes back inside and he interacts with Jesus a little bit more, and Jesus refuses to defend himself. So Pilate comes back outside and he has some more interaction with the crowd. But they shouted, "Take him away, crucify him." Pilate interacts with them. He says, "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asks. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Matthew 27:24 says, Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting. So Pilate, this is verse 16 of John 19, Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, Jesus went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. What struck me about this as I read it was the fear that Pilate had. He was afraid. It mentions it several times, two or three times, in this very sparse little passage about the crowd. And it reminded me of something that I worked on in criminal law, which is a lynching. In theory, the last official lynching in South Carolina was the lynching of Willie Earl in 1947. But in fact, my very first murder case that I worked on in the criminal side of the state attorney general's office was a lynching case in the 1990s. And I learned a lot about lynching, and I studied the history of lynching somewhat. And there's a couple things that really stick out about lynchings to me. One is the mob mentality, just this big mob, and the fact that it's outside the law. But there's a lot of times a violent crowd that's people are afraid of it. An example, in Greenville County one time, a man was being held in a jail cell, and the crowd was coming after him to lynch him. And the judge knew that there was nothing they could do to stop it because the crowd was going to basically, overpower them and get the man out and kill him. And so the judge went and grabbed a lawyer out of the hallway who was there on another case and said, "We're going to have a murder trial in 30 minutes. You have 30 minutes to prepare your case." And that's how they prevented the mob from actually killing the man right then and there. But there was this fear that was going on in the judicial system, and it was going to be outside everybody's control. And I think we've seen some of that in the Capitol riots just recently, within the last year or two, was what a mob can do, and they can overwhelm the security very easily. And I think Pontius Pilate, when I read these lines, I think 2,000 years ago, as sparse as this record is, we could say that he might have been facing a similar kind of situation. And the other thing about a lynching is that the responsibility for the lynching can't be attributed to any one particular person. It's spread out. There's so many people involved that they were all responsible. And that's what a lynching is. You can't say that person A caused the death, or that person B caused the death, or that person C caused the death, but collectively, they all contributed. And in this case, this mob was contributing. And that's, if you'll bear with me, I know that there's people who would say, oh, that's not a good analogy, but just follow with me a little bit, because it brings us up to, our temptation in any situation is to look at those people back then, 2,000 years ago, and what did they do? And they were bad. But for every finger that's pointed towards us, there's three fingers pointed back at myself. And so I need to look at myself and say, what are my blinders? What am I doing? And that's what I'd like to think about today in the context of our society, and particularly when I started thinking about lynching, and because lynching is a relatively, not unknown in the history of South Carolina. And you know what they say, if you don't know your history, you might repeat it. But it also, the culture of slavery, the culture of Jim Crow, the culture of lynching permeates every aspect of our current society and where we are today. And so that's one reason lynching is particularly, like, I latched onto that idea, because it provides a window for me to look at myself and my culture. And for that reason, that's actually the reason that oh my goodness, I closed my Acrobat file that I had open. Hold on just a second. I have to open it. So I found my Acrobat file. So I'm going to share my screen, and I want to share this. This is in the Deep South. It's not in South Carolina, but something about this picture struck me, and I'll tell you what it is that these people look so ordinary, and not just ordinary, they're like respectable. They have on ironed shirts that are clean and starched, and collars and ties, and they're wearing hats, and some of them are smiling, and they look like they could have just come out of church or something. And yet they've just done something heinous. And I thought, how could this happen? And what cultural blinders did they have that enabled them to do this? And following that thought about saying, how could this happen? I went to this picture. And what's even more striking about this picture is that every one of these girls was a Christian in a Christian nation. And you say, how could they have had on these cultural blinders that prevented them from seeing what was going on? And so I think that it's really important that we be willing to examine not just our inner self and our inner life, but also our culture and where our culture is, and say, are we part of a mob? And so I want to go there because, right now in our culture, it's very hard to tell what is true and what is right and what is correct. And so that leads me to this picture and say, this man, his name, I think we need to say his name because he did not survive World War II. His name was August Landmesser. And of all these people who were saluting Hitler, he was the only one who refused. And it's so hard. Have you ever thought about how hard it would be to do that when everybody was doing a Heil Hitler salute, and for you to be the only person who didn't. Think about when you're the only person maybe who's wearing a mask or who's doing something that's outside what's the norm in our own culture. What if you even decided to sit during the hymn and you feel a little bit awkward to sit during the hymn when in the service? And so you think, how hard is it to just go completely to examine your own culture, examine my own culture, and step outside it and say, no, this is wrong. And so I wanted to kind of go there and challenge us to do that. And in this particular thing, too, I was struck by Matthew 25:44, which is where the righteous are being set aside and the unrighteous are being cast away. And the people who are being cast away say, Matthew 25:44, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you naked? When did we see you in prison and not help you? Ignorance is no excuse. They didn't see, they didn't recognize the opportunity, but ignorance is no excuse. They either chose not to see or didn't see, but we have an obligation to seek and to know and to do the right thing. And in that regard, I asked my grandmother, I'm going to stop my screen share for a second because this picture is of my grandmother right here. She was in the prime of her life in the 1930s. And I said, before she died, I just need to ask her, so just to preserve the memory. I said, what did you know and when about Hitler? And she said to me, Hitler was very popular. And a lot of people in the United States were rallying, the Nazi Party. Hitler revived the economy of Germany, and he made Germany great again. And um, we knew that there was a war going on, and we knew that there was a lot of propaganda. And we heard there were atrocities, but we thought it was all propaganda. We just didn't believe it. In other words, she said, we thought it was just fake news. And with that, I thought about our obligation to know the truth and to perceive the truth and seek the truth. And that led me um, to think about the truth and what is the truth and how do we know what is true in an era like today when there's so many challenges and these problems are here, and it's a very challenging time to know what is true and how do we pursue it, and are we willing to look for the truth? Are we willing to look at it? Or are we just going to say, oh, I don't want to be involved, I don't want to know about that? But I think we have an obligation to know about that. So I'm just going to leave you with that thought. And so would you please just say a little prayer with me? Lord, help us to seek you. Thank you, first of all, for your son, for sending him to take care of us and to intercede for us and to provide a path for us to follow and an example. And Father, help us to discern the truth, to have the courage to pursue the truth, and to not be part of the mob. Thank you, in Jesus' name. And now I'm going to do something a little crazy. You've been with me this long, so I'm going to sing a song for you. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Ooh, ooh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Let's just pray that we're not part of the crucifying crowd.